If you ask most people what passive income means, they will give you a fantasy. They imagine a few rental properties, a few dividend checks, maybe some index funds, and then a life where money arrives while they sleep and nothing hard ever needs to be decided again. It is a beautiful fantasy. It is also one of the most dangerous financial myths of the modern era. I have spent most of my life around businesses, markets, capital allocation, cash flow, and people who believe that enough money would someday remove uncertainty from life. The older I get, the less I believe in fairy tales about finance. Money can buy time, it can buy autonomy, it can buy margin, it can buy the right not to take foolish orders from foolish people. Those are extraordinary things, but it does not suspend arithmetic. It does not repeal volatility. It does not eliminate inflation. It does not turn human psychology into something calm and rational just because the brokerage account has more zeros in it. That is why I think the conversation around passive income needs to be cleaned up. Not because passive income is fake, because the version most people are sold is fake. Real passive income exists. What does not exist, at least not for most people, is the fantasy of perfect hands-off money that arrives forever without trade-offs, maintenance, judgment, or emotional cost. The source document you gave me makes this point well right from the opening. It says the internet loves to sell the dream of making money while you sleep, but that true hands-off passive income is fragile, expensive to buy, and much slower to build than most people admit. It argues that what real financial independence usually looks like is not total passivity, but a messy combination of investment withdrawals, semi-passive side income, and active decision-making, faithful site fay turn 85 file 0 fay that is the right place to begin. Passive income is not a switch. It is an ecosystem. And if you build the ecosystem wrong, you do not merely lose some money. You lose the freedom the whole plan was supposed to buy you. So let me tell you how I would think about it. I would begin by ignoring the slogans and looking at the machine. A machine that can support your life without a paycheck has to do one of only a few things. It has to produce cash directly, or it has to grow fast enough that you can sell small pieces of it over time without killing it, or in the strongest version, it does both. That is it. All the romance in the world cannot improve that math. And most people, when they first discover the idea of passive income, make the same mistake. They ask which asset pays. That is not the first question. The first question is what kind of pressure the asset will put on me later, because the wrong income stream can turn into a second job. The wrong withdrawal plan can turn into a panic spiral. The wrong lifestyle can turn any portfolio into a prison sentence of permanent worry. This is why I would never tell someone to chase passive income first. I would tell him to understand the structure first. The source divides the structure into two broad models, the cash flow model and the total return model. Cash flow means the assets themselves spit off income, like dividends, rent, royalties, or interest. Total return means the portfolio grows over time and you sell small parts of it to fund spending. The source says intelligent people often argue over which one is better, but that in practice the smartest people usually end up using some version of both. Faithful site fay turn 85 file 0 fay, that is exactly how I think. Purity is overrated in finance. I do not care whether an idea sounds elegant in a forum argument. I care whether it survives real life. And real life is noisy enough that mixed structures often outperform ideological purity simply because they give the owner more room to adapt. Now, let us begin with the most famous number in the whole discussion, the 4% rule. This number has become a kind of scripture in the financial independence world, and like most scripture, it is usually quoted by people who understand it only halfway. The source explains the rule in the standard way. William Bengen's research suggested that a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds could historically support a first-year withdrawal of 4%, adjusted for inflation each year after, with a high probability of lasting for 30 years. This is where the common shorthand of 25 times annual spending comes from. Spend $40,000 a year. Need about 1 million invested, spend 80,000, need about 2 million fay file site, fay turn 85 file 0 fay. That is fine as a starting point. It is not fine as a religion. A starting point is useful because it gives the mind something to work with. A religion is dangerous because it makes people forget uncertainty exists. The source is careful about this. It notes that more recent research from firms like Morningstar has at times suggested lower safe withdrawal rates, closer to 3.3% or 3.7%, depending on valuations and bond yields. It also points out that the difference sounds small but is enormous in practice. Needing $40,000 a year at 4% requires about $1 million. Needing $40,000 at 3.5% requires about $1.15 million. That extra $150,000 is not an academic detail. It can represent years of extra work. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 85 File 0 Fay. That is one reason I dislike casual certainty around the rule. A half-point difference in withdrawal rate is not just a mathematical footnote. It can be the difference between freedom and fragility. And there is another reason the 4% rule is misunderstood. It is not really passive income in the way most people mean the phrase. If your system depends on selling pieces of the portfolio over time, you are not living on untouched golden eggs. You are gradually liquidating tiny parts of the goose and betting that what remains will keep growing faster than you are consuming it. Now, that can still work beautifully, it often has, but it is a different psychological experience than the language of passive income suggests. The person receiving rent or dividends feels like money is being generated for him. The person selling a slice of a fund every quarter often feels like he is consuming the base, even if the math says the strategy is sustainable. That feeling matters, because money is never only math, it is math plus psychology. And once your paycheck disappears, psychology becomes one of the most important assets or liabilities you own. Now let us go one level deeper: inflation. This is where many elegant plans die ugly deaths. The source states, the problem simply a person with $1 million who assumes he can withdraw $40,000 forever is thinking in today's dollars. If inflation runs at only 3%, then 20 years later he may need roughly $72,000 to buy what $40,000 buys. Now, if his income source is fixed and not growing, he is effectively taking a pay cut every year. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 85 File 0 Fay, that is the quiet cruelty of inflation. It does not usually arrive like a thief kicking in the front door. It behaves more like rot. At first everything seems fine. Then one day you realize the same money buys noticeably less dignity than it once did. This is why I do not trust fixed income streams by themselves unless there is so much margin that shrinking purchasing power will not matter much. People who rely purely on non-growing fixed income often feel safe in year one and weaker every year after that. They say, but the check still comes. Fine, the question is what the check still buys. That is why equities remain so important even in any serious passive income plan. Not because they are smooth, they are not, because over long periods they are one of the few asset classes with a real history of outrunning inflation. This brings us to the first great conflict in passive income planning: security versus growth. People want certainty, they want checks, they want reliability, they want to feel that the principal is untouched and the money just appears. At the same time, they need growth because the world keeps charging more. That conflict is why no single perfect passive income asset exists for ordinary people. If something feels extremely safe and extremely hands-off, it often has weak growth. If it has strong growth, it often comes with volatility and uncertainty. That is the central tension. The intelligent response is not denial, it is design. Now, let us shift to the cash flow model because this is where fantasies multiply fastest. The source describes the cash flow model as the version most people picture when they hear passive income. You own rentals, dividends, stocks, or royalties, the principal remains intact. And you live on the cash the assets throw off. The source is very honest about why this feels so attractive. You still own the house, you still own the shares, the principal seems untouched. If the market crashes, you imagine the rent or dividend still arrives. It feels robust and tangible. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn 85 File 0 Fay, that feeling of tangibility is powerful. It can also be very misleading. The trap, as the source says clearly, is that revenue is not income. A duplex renting for $2,000 a month is not producing $2,000 a month of spendable passive income. You still have property tax insurance, repairs, vacancy, management, and capital expenditures. Once all of that is subtracted, the net may be a fraction of the top line, not the top line itself. Payfilicite Fayturn 85 file 0 Fay. This is one of the oldest mistakes in all of investing. Confusing gross with real, people do this with rental property. They do it with businesses, they do it with side hustles, they do it with dividend portfolios. They see the money entering the top of the machine and assume too much of it belongs to them at the bottom. Real life is more expensive than top-line fantasy. Now let me speak plainly about rental property, because real estate is where passive income dreams go to become management problems. A person says he wants 10 units free and clear producing $40,000 or $50,000 a year. Fine. What he often means is that he wants cash flow without chaos. What he usually gets, unless he has structured the operation carefully, is a property business. Tenants, repairs, turnover, insurance questions, contractors, city rules, leakage, bad months, unexpected costs. This is why the source says many landlords discover they have not really escaped work at all. They have just traded a boss for a collection of tenants and maintenance issues that interrupt evenings and weekends instead of office hours. It argues that real estate can scale, but is rarely passive unless you hire management, which of course cuts the returns further. Payfilicite Fayturn 85 file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. I have nothing against real estate, but I do have something against lies. And the lie is that because an asset looks physical and the check arrives monthly, the owner has somehow escaped operational burden. What he has really done is chosen a different kind of burden that can still be a good choice. It is not a passive fairy tale. The same issue shows up with dividends. People fall in love with dividend yield because it feels like salary replacement from a civilized source, but a high yield is never the whole story. What matters is whether the underlying business can sustain and grow that payment. A 7% dividend from a weakening enterprise is often far more dangerous than a 2% yield from an extraordinary business with strong growth. This is another place where purity thinking destroys people. The source makes an intelligent suggestion here. It argues that cash flow assets should often be treated as stabilizers rather than the entire engine. Maybe the rentals or dividends cover groceries and utilities. Maybe they cover the absolute essentials. Then the growth portfolio handles the rest. In that structure, the semi-passive cash flow lowers the stress on the total return engine without forcing the cash flow assets to carry the entire life on their backs. Payfilicite Fayturn 85 file 0 Fay. That is what I would call adult planning. Not because it sounds elegant, because it acknowledges how the human nervous system actually works. A person who knows the basics of his life are covered by some kind of recurring cash flow can often hold the growth portfolio with much more discipline during bad years. That matters enormously. Most plans fail not because the spreadsheet was mathematically illegal. They fail because the owner was psychologically unprepared for how it would feel to live inside the plan during stress. That brings us directly to the most dangerous force in the whole discussion. Sequence of returns risk. This is where elegant retirement math gets dragged into the real world. The source explains it correctly. If the market falls sharply in the first years after you retire and you are simultaneously withdrawing money to live, you are selling assets at depressed prices and permanently shrinking the capital base that would otherwise have had time to recover. Two portfolios with the same average long-term return can have radically different outcomes depending on the order in which those returns occur. A bad sequence early is much worse than a bad sequence later. Payfilicite Fayturn 85 file 0 Fay. That is not just technical risk, it is existential risk, because the person who retires into a bad sequence does not experience the losses as mere volatility. He experiences them as spending pressure colliding with falling asset values. The source runs through an example of retiring with $1 million, suffering a 20% drop in year one, withdrawing $40,000, then getting hit again in year two while continuing withdrawals. That kind of sequence can dig a hole so deep that later good returns may not fully repair it because there is less capital left to participate. Felicite Fayturn 85 File 0 Fay. This is why I always tell people that averages are some of the most misleading comforts in finance. The average return over 30 years is not what you live. You live the order. And order matters profoundly when withdrawals begin. That is also why the emotional side becomes so vicious here. When you are still working, a market drawdown is unpleasant but abstract, your salary is still arriving, your portfolio is wounded, but it is not feeding you dinner that week. When you are living on the portfolio, the relationship changes completely. A 20% decline is not a chart event. It is a threat to identity, safety, and future freedom. That is when nerves break. And as the source says, many retirements fail not because the math was impossible, but because the person could not emotionally survive the first serious assault. They sell panic, go to cash, or lose confidence in the system at exactly the worst moment. Felicite Fayturn 85 File 0 Fay. That is why I care so much about buffers. Not because cash is mathematically ideal at every moment, because a buffer keeps people from being forced into irreversible actions during temporary pain. The source recommends 1 to 3 years of living expenses in cash or short-term bonds at the start of retirement, calling this a cash buffer or bond tent. The point is straightforward. If the market crashes, you spend the buffer and do not sell the stock portfolio at depressed prices. Later, if the market recovers, you replenish the buffer. Felicite Fayturn 85 File 0 Fay. This is one of those ideas that excites no one and saves many. People want the highest expected return. I want a structure strong enough to survive bad order. Cash drags on return. Yes, but it can also buy the one thing a retiree cannot easily afford to lose: time. Time for the market to recover. Time for panic to pass. Time to avoid converting temporary decline into permanent damage. That is a beautiful use of cash. Now, while all of this is happening on the portfolio side, there is another variable far more powerful than most people admit. Spending. The source says this directly and correctly. The critical variable is not only income, but spending, because the familiar 25 times rule means every dollar of annual spending requires roughly $25 of invested capital to sustain under a 4% model. A $15 monthly subscription is not just a $15 decision. It represents capital that has to be accumulated and maintained to support it indefinitely. A $500 monthly car payment is not just a payment. It is roughly $150,000 of portfolio burden if you expect passive assets to carry it forever. Felicite Fayturn 85 File 0 Fay. That is one of the most useful mental models in all of personal finance. Every recurring expense is a shadow portfolio requirement. Once you start seeing spending that way, your taste changes. Luxury is no longer just what it costs today. Luxury is what it costs in years of freedom. This is why I have long believed that reducing spending has a double effect. It increases the amount available to invest, and it reduces the amount your portfolio must eventually produce. That double win is extremely powerful. The source introduces something called the passive FI ratio, which is simply passive income divided by expenses. If you spend $40,000 and already have $10,000 in passive income, you are a quarter of the way there. It then makes a subtle but very important point. Progress is not linear psychologically. Once even part of your fixed life is covered, your options widen dramatically. Cover the rent or mortgage, and suddenly you can think differently about work, risk, and fulfillment, even before you have reached 100%. Felicite Fayturn 85 File 0 Fay. This is exactly right. People imagine financial freedom as a binary event, working or not working, free or trapped. That is too crude. Freedom often arrives in layers. First, enough buffer that a surprise no longer destroys the month. Then enough portfolio or side income that one major line item is covered. Then enough optionality that you could choose a lower paying but more interesting job. Then enough assets that survival is guaranteed, even if luxuries still require activity. By the time you reach the final number, the real psychological transformation has usually already begun much earlier. That is why I dislike waiting for perfection before changing life design. A person at 50% coverage may already be far less trapped than the person at 0%, even if neither is technically retired, which leads to one of the biggest dangers in the entire process. Lifestyle creep. The source calls this the moving goalpost problem, and it describes it perfectly. A person starts with one number in mind, hits it, then decides he actually needs twice that because the imagination of retirement became more luxurious than the original plan. A boat appears, business class flights appear, new standards quietly rise. The portfolio number grows, but freedom does not arrive because spending keeps climbing alongside it. Fay turn 85 file 0 Fay. This is a silent killer. Not because enjoying life is wrong, because a moving target keeps freedom perpetually one milestone away. That is why I respect people who decide what enough means and defend it. Enough is not a surrender word. It is a control word without enough. Ambition becomes a treadmill. Now, after all the math and all the risk, we arrive at the thing almost no spreadsheet captures well. Purpose. The source is very strong on this point. It distinguishes retiring from something versus retiring to something. It says many people discover painfully that endless leisure is not a design for human satisfaction. A week at the beach can feel like paradise. A year at the beach can become a crisis of purpose. People derive status, social structure, challenge, and utility from work. And when that disappears abruptly, many find the vacuum harder than expected. The source argues that the most successful passive income earners often do not stop working entirely. They stop doing work they hate, they move toward optional work. Fay turn 85 file 0 Fay. That is exactly how I think about it. The goal of passive income is not to become inert. The goal is autonomy. A person without autonomy is renting his life. A person with autonomy can choose. That does not mean he will choose idleness. Often he will choose better work, more meaningful work, part-time work, creative work, community work, advisory work, some form of problem solving that uses his mind without enslaving it. This is why I think the phrase retire early can be misleading. The better phrase is own your schedule. That is what people really want, not to do nothing. To stop being forced into things that feel deadening. Now the source introduces a distinction between lean fee and fat fi. Lean fee means the passive income or portfolio supports a bare bones life, but with fragility and little room. Fat fee means much more abundance and margin, but requires more time and capital. The source suggests that for many people, the sweet spot is neither extreme. It is enough passive support for survival plus enough optional work to preserve luxury, challenge, and psychological structure. Fay turn 85 file 0 Fay. That is a sensible middle path. If I were designing my own system from scratch, I would not aim first for perfect passivity. I would aim for baseline invulnerability. Enough that my food, housing, utilities, and dignity are not at the mercy of one employer or one bad quarter. Then I would preserve the ability to work on my own terms for extras, for stimulation, and for strategic margin. That is not failure. That is intelligent design. It removes the pressure from the portfolio without reintroducing the old trap of compulsory labor. Now let me put all of this together in the form I think matters most. Can you live off passive income? Yes, but only if you stop treating passive income like a magic category and start treating it like a system. That system needs at least 6 things: a realistic withdrawal rate rather than a fantasy one, some protection against inflation, some defense against sequence risk, a spending level that reflects enough rather than endless appetite, at least some flexibility to cut, delay, or adapt when markets misbehave, and a life design that gives you something to retire to, not merely something to escape from. This is why I do not believe the safest people are the ones with the single biggest portfolio. The source says something similar near the end. It argues that the most secure people are often the ones who are flexible, who can scale spending down or scale income up depending on what the world throws at them. That is a beautiful and practical definition of security. Fay turn 85 file 0. Fay flexibility is underrated because it is hard to put into a heroic chart, but flexibility is what keeps systems alive when the world stops cooperating. A person who can trim spending, earn a little, shift gears, Delay luxuries. And avoid panic is stronger than a person with a slightly bigger portfolio and no emotional or practical flexibility at all. That is why I think the real passive income myth is not merely that money can arrive while you sleep. The deeper myth is that once the machine is built, you stop needing judgment. Number the machine reduces dependence on labor. It does not eliminate the need for judgment. Judgment is what keeps the machine from being destroyed by overconfidence, rigidity, or fantasy. And if I had to reduce the entire discussion to one sentence, it would be this: passive income is not the art of doing nothing. It is the art of arranging your money, your spending, your buffers, and your mind so that freedom survives even when the world refuses to cooperate. That is the real goal, and that goal is worth building carefully.